The studio lights burned hot, casting sharp shadows across the sleek desk where Stephen Colbert sat, his usual grin replaced by a tight, twitching smirk. The audience, packed into the theater, buzzed with unease. They had come for laughs, but the air crackled with something darker. Across from Stephen, Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General, adjusted her posture, her eyes narrowing as she sensed the shift in his mood. The interview had started smoothly, with Stephen tossing out his trademark quips, but now, 10 minutes in, the conversation had veered into dangerous territory. It wasn't politics or policy that sparked the fire. It was personal, raw, and entirely unexpected. Stephen leaned forward, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of his desk. Earlier that day, during a pre-show meeting, a producer had let slip a rumor. Pam had made cutting remarks about Stephen's late father, a man he revered, at a private event years ago. The story was unconfirmed, but it had festered in Stephen's mind all day, poisoning his usual charm. He had planned to keep things light, but now, with Pam sitting smugly across from him, her polished smile grating on his nerves, he couldn't hold back. The audience didn't know the backstory, but they could feel the venom building. "You know, Pam," Stephen said, his voice low and sharp, cutting through the studio's hum, "some people say things behind closed doors they'd never dare repeat in public. Things about family, about people who can't defend themselves." His words hung heavy, each one laced with accusation. Pam's smile faltered, her fingers tightening around the armrest of her chair. She wasn't used to being challenged like this, not on live television, and certainly not by a comedian who was supposed to play nice. "What are you getting at, Stephen?" Pam shot back, her tone icy, her eyes locking onto his. She leaned forward, mirroring his aggression, refusing to shrink. "If you've got something to say, spit it out. Don't hide behind vague little jabs." The audience gasped, a ripple of shock spreading through the crowd. Stephen's jaw clenched, his usual quick wit replaced by something harder, more dangerous. He hadn't expected her to push back so fast, and it only fueled his anger. "I'm talking about respect," Stephen snapped, his voice rising, the words slicing through the tense air. "Or the lack of it. You think you can waltz in here, all high and mighty, after dragging someone's name through the mud? My father's name?" The audience fell silent, the weight of his accusation landing like a punch. Pam's face flushed, her composure cracking. She hadn't anticipated this, hadn't prepared for Stephen to unearth a rumor she barely remembered, but she wasn't about to let him humiliate her on national television. "That's a lie," Pam hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "I never said anything about your father. You're making this up to ambush me, to make me look bad. This is low, even for you." She pointed a finger at him, her hand shaking slightly, betraying the rage bubbling beneath her polished exterior. The studio felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with hostility. The producers in the control booth exchanged panicked glances, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the chaos unfold. Stephen stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, a sound that echoed through the stunned silence. "Don't play innocent," he growled, towering over the desk. "You think I'd bring this up if I didn't know the truth?" His voice was raw, personal, stripped of the polished humor he was known for. Pam rose to her feet, matching his stance, her eyes blazing. The audience held its breath, sensing the interview was spiraling into something unforgettable, something they'd talk about for years. The studio felt like it was holding its breath, the silence so thick it pressed against the walls. Stephen Colbert and Pam Bondi stood inches apart, the desk between them a flimsy barrier against the storm of their anger. The audience, frozen in their seats, could barely blink, their eyes darting between the two figures locked in a verbal duel. Stephen's face was a mask of fury, his usual warmth replaced by a cold, unrelenting glare. Pam, her shoulders squared, met his stare with equal fire, her lips pressed into a thin line. The rumor about her remarks on Stephen's father had ignited this fight, but now it was about something bigger, pride, reputation, and who would back down first. "You want to talk truth?" Pam spat, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She stepped closer, her heels clicking on the polished floor, closing the gap between them. "You're the one twisting stories, Stephen. You think you can bully me on your little stage, in front of your adoring fans? I've faced worse than you." Her words dripped with contempt, each one a challenge, daring him to escalate further. The audience murmured, a low hum of shock and excitement as the tension coiled tighter. Stephen's hands balled into fists, his knuckles pale against the dark wood of the desk. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, audible only because of the microphone pinned to his lapel. "You don't get to lecture me about bullying," he said, each word deliberate, heavy with accusation. "Not after what you said. Not after you thought you could smear someone I loved and walk away clean." His eyes never left hers, searching for a crack in her defiance, a hint of guilt. But Pam's gaze was steel, unyielding. "Prove it," she shot back, her voice rising, carrying a challenge that echoed through the studio. "You've got nothing but gossip and you're using it to play the victim. Pathetic." She turned slightly, addressing the audience now, her arms crossed, tightly. "This man's built a career on making people laugh, but tonight he's just making a fool of himself." The crowd gasped, some clapping nervously, others whispering to their neighbors. Pam's move was bold, pulling the audience into the fight, and it stung Stephen like a slap. He stepped around the desk, closing the distance between them, his movements sharp and deliberate. The producers in the control booth scrambled, one shouting into a headset to keep the cameras rolling. "Don't you dare turn this on me," Stephen growled, his voice raw, the pain behind it unmistakable. "You think you can spin this, make me the bad guy? I know what you did, Pam. I know." His finger jabbed the air, stopping just short of her chest, a gesture that made the audience lean forward, hearts pounding. Pam didn't flinch. Instead, she laughed, a short, bitter sound that cut through the room like a knife. "You're unraveling." "Stephen," she said, her tone mocking, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "You're so desperate to pin something on me, you're forgetting who's watching. You're ruining your own show." She gestured toward the audience, her hand sweeping wide, as if to remind him of the hundreds of eyes bearing witness. But her taunt only poured fuel on the fire raging inside him. "Ruining my show?" Stephen's voice cracked with fury, his face inches from hers now. "You walked in here thinking you could control this, control me, but you're not walking out unscathed." The threat hung in the air, heavy and real, and for the first time Pam's confidence wavered. Her lips parted, but no words came. The studio was a powder keg, and Stephen's words were the spark, ready to ignite whatever came next. The studio air felt electric, charged with the raw hostility between Stephen Colbert and Pam Bondi. They stood so close now that the desk was no longer a barrier, their faces inches apart, each refusing to yield. Stephen's last words, a vow that Pam wouldn't leave unscathed, lingered like smoke after a gunshot. The audience, caught in the grip of the unfolding drama, leaned forward, their whispers silenced by the weight of the moment. Pam's brief hesitation, that fleeting crack in her armor, vanished as quickly as it appeared. She straightened, her eyes blazing with renewed defiance, determined to reclaim control. "You think you can scare me?" Pam said, her voice steady but laced with venom. She took a deliberate step back, not out of fear, but to command the space, her hands planting firmly on her hips. "I've dealt with bigger threats than you, Stephen. You're just a man with a microphone, throwing a tantrum because you heard a rumor you didn't like." Her words were a calculated jab, meant to diminish him, to paint him as petty in front of the audience. A few spectators shifted uncomfortably, torn between loyalties, their murmurs rising like a distant storm. Stephen's face twisted, his anger flaring hotter at her dismissal. He followed her step, refusing to let her create distance. "A rumor?" he said, his voice low, dangerous, each syllable dripping with scorn. "You call dragging my father's memory through the dirt a rumor? You're not just a liar, Pam. You're a coward who hides behind denial." His accusation landed hard, and the audience gasped, the sound sharp in the charged silence. He pointed at her again, his hand steady now, his rage focused into something, almost tangible. Pam's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer. She wasn't about to let him paint her as weak. "Coward?" she fired back, her voice rising to match his intensity. "Look at you, Stephen, waving your pain around like a weapon. You want sympathy? You won't get it from me." She turned to the crowd, her gesture sharp, commanding their attention. "He's trying to make this about him, about his feelings. But this is my name he's attacking. My honor." Her voice cracked on the last word, revealing a glimpse of the personal toll this fight was taking, though she quickly masked it with a glare. The audience was a sea of wide eyes and open mouths, some nodding faintly at Pam's words, others shaking, their heads, loyal to Stephen. The divide fueled the tension, making the studio feel like a courtroom on the verge of a verdict. Stephen sensed the shift, the way Pam was trying to sway the crowd, and it infuriated him. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a growl that carried through the microphones. "Your Honor," he said, the words heavy with mockery, "you lost that when you thought you could tear down a good man's name and face no consequences." Pammy wheeled on him, her patience snapping like a brittle twig. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the studio walls, startling even the seasoned camera crew. "You keep saying I did this, but where's your proof? You're humiliating yourself, Stephen, and you're too blind to see it." Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer force of her anger as she pointed at the audience. "They see it. They know you're out of control." Her words were a gauntlet thrown down, a challenge to his reputation, his very identity, as a beloved host. Stephen froze, her words cutting deeper than he'd expected. The audience's murmurs grew louder, a mix of agreement and dissent, and for a moment doubt flickered in his eyes. Had he gone too far? But the pain of the rumor, the wound it had reopened, surged back, drowning his hesitation. He opened his mouth, ready to unleash a response that would shake the room, when a new sound pierced the chaos, shifting the battle in a way neither expected. The sharp sound of a woman's voice cut through the studio, slicing the thick tension like a blade. "Stop this now!" It was Stephen's longtime producer, Ellen, standing at the edge of the stage, her face pale but determined. Her sudden appearance stunned the crowd, their murmurs fading into a hush. Stephen and Pam turned, caught off guard, their fury momentarily derailed. Ellen, usually hidden in the control booth, had never stepped into the spotlight before, but now she marched forward, her eyes locked on Stephen. The audience leaned forward, sensing a new twist in the drama, their hearts pounding as the fight took an unexpected turn. "Stephen, you're tearing everything apart," Ellen said, her voice shaking but firm, loud enough for the microphones to catch. "This isn't you. You're better than this." Her words hit like a slap, raw and personal, exposing a side of Stephen the audience rarely saw. His shoulders stiffened, his face a mix of shock and betrayal. Pam seized the moment, her lips curling into a faint, triumphant smirk, sensing a crack in Stephen's resolve. But she stayed silent, letting Ellen's interruption do the damage for her. Stephen's eyes darted from Ellen to the audience, the weight of their stares pressing down on him. He'd built his career on wit and warmth, but now he stood exposed, his anger laid bare. "Ellen," he said, his voice low, strained, "you don't know what she did. You don't know what I'm fighting for." His words were meant to rally, but they sounded desperate, a man grasping for control. The audience shifted, some nodding in support, others whispering, unsure who to back in this messy human clash. Pam saw her chance and pounced. "Even your own team can't stand by you," she said, her tone sharp, cutting. She stepped toward Ellen, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I feel for you, working for someone who loses it like this. He's unhinged." Her words were a knife, twisting to wound Stephen's pride and sway the crowd. A few audience members gasped, others clapped faintly, drawn to Pam's bold attack. The studio felt like a battlefield, loyalties splitting as the fight grew uglier. Ellen's face flushed, her hands clenching at her sides. "Don't you dare drag me into your mess," she snapped at Pam, her voice rising. "I've known Stephen for years, and he's a good man. But this?" She gestured at the chaos, the desk, the glaring lights. "This isn't the way to settle it." Her loyalty to Stephen was clear, but her plea for peace only fueled Pam's fire. Pam laughed, a cold, biting sound that echoed through the room. "Good man? He's a performer, Ellen, and tonight he's bombing." The audience erupted, a mix of cheers and boos, the noise swelling like a wave. Stephen's face darkened, Pam's words and Ellen's betrayal colliding in his chest. He turned to Pam, his voice a growl. "You think you've won? You think you can mock me, my team, my family, and walk away?" He stepped closer, his presence towering, his anger reigniting. "I'm not done, Pam, not by a long shot." His words were a promise, heavy with intent, and the crowd roared, some chanting his name, others shouting for Pam to fight back. Pam didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her eyes like flint. "Bring it on," she said, her voice steady, daring him to escalate. "You've already lost their respect." She nodded toward the audience, her gesture sharp, accusing. "You're a joke now, Stephen, and you did it to yourself." Her words were a final blow, meant to crush him, but they only stoked his resolve. The studio vibrated with energy, the crowd feeding off the raw emotion, every eye glued to the stage. Ellen, caught between them, raised her hands, her voice breaking. "Both of you stop! You're ruining everything!" But her plea was drowned by the audience's roar, their excitement overtaking reason. Stephen and Pam ignored her, their focus locked on each other, two forces too far gone to back down. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every tense line on their faces, every spark of fury. The producers, frozen in the booth, let the chaos unfold, knowing this moment would be talked about for years. Stephen's chest heaved, his mind racing. He knew he was at a crossroads, back down and lose face, or fight harder and risk everything. Pam's smirk, Ellen's plea, the audience's divided cheers all pressed against him. But something shifted inside him, a spark of clarity cutting through the haze of anger. He wasn't just fighting Pam anymore. He was fighting for his name, his father's memory, and the trust of everyone watching. The battle wasn't over, but it was about to change. The studio was a cauldron of noise, the audience's cheers and boos crashing like waves against the stage, where Stephen Colbert and Pam Bondi stood, locked in their fierce standoff. Ellen's desperate plea to stop the fight faded into the roar, her hands still raised, her face etched with worry. Stephen's eyes, burning with a mix of anger and resolve, never left Pam's. Her smirk, her taunts about his lost respect, had pushed him to the edge, but now something steadier took root. This wasn't just about the rumor anymore, or the pain of his father's memory. It was about who he was, and who he wanted to be in front of the world watching. Stephen took a slow step back, his chest rising as he drew a deep breath. The audience quieted, sensing a shift, their eyes fixed on him. Pam tilted her head, her smirk faltering, unsure of his next move. "What's this?" she said, her voice sharp but wary. "Finally out of steam, Stephen?" Her words were meant to sting, to keep him on the defensive, but they lacked the bite of before. The crowd murmured, waiting, the air heavy with anticipation. "I'm not out of anything," Stephen said, his voice calm now, but strong, carrying a quiet power that filled the room. He turned to the audience, his gaze sweeping over their faces, connecting with them in a way only he could. "You came here for truth, not a shouting match. And the truth is, I let my anger take over. I let her get to me. He glanced at Pam, his eyes steady, no longer clouded by rage. But I don't need to tear you down to stand up for what matters. The audience erupted in applause, a wave of support that shook the studio. Pam's face tightened, her hands clenching as she realized the tide was turning. "Don't play noble now," she snapped, stepping forward, her voice rising to reclaim control. "You started this, Stephen. You accused me, attacked me, and now you want to act like the hero?" Her words were desperate, grasping, but the crowd's cheers drowned her out, their loyalty shifting firmly to Stephen. Ellen, still on stage, lowered her hands, her eyes wide with relief. She nodded at Stephen, a silent acknowledgement of his choice to rise above. "That's the man I know," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the crowd. But Stephen caught it, a small smile breaking through his stern expression. He turned back to Pam, his posture relaxed but unyielding. "You can deny what you said about my father," he said, his tone even, "but you can't deny the kind of person you are. And that's enough for me." Pam's jaw dropped, her eyes flashing with fury, but she had no response. The audience's cheers grew louder, a chant of Stephen's name rising, filling the studio with a triumphant energy. She took a step back, her confidence crumbling under the weight of their rejection. "This isn't over," she hissed, but her voice was lost in the noise, her exit path clear as she turned toward the wings. Stephen didn't stop her, didn't need to. He'd won, not by shouting, but by reclaiming his ground. As Pam disappeared, offstage, the crowd's roar reached a fever pitch, hands clapping, feet stomping. Stephen faced them, raising a hand to quiet the noise, his smile genuine now, warm. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This show's about honesty, about family, about standing up. Tonight, we did that together." The audience cheered again, their faces glowing with pride, connected to him in a way that felt personal, real. Ellen stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did good," she whispered, and Stephen nodded, the weight of the night lifting. The cameras panned across the crowd, capturing their joy, their unity. The producers in the booth exhaled, knowing they'd caught lightning in a bottle. Stephen sat back at his desk, the lights softer now, the studio alive with a new energy. He'd faced the fire, and he'd come out stronger, his name intact, his heart full. The show ended with Stephen's signature wave, but this time it felt different, like a promise kept. The audience rose, clapping as the credits rolled, their voices carrying out into the night. Stephen had turned a disaster into a victory, not just for himself, but for everyone who'd watched, who'd felt the weight of truth and come out on the other side.